Sego, Ani, hello. My name is Bob, and I'm a senior fellow with First Peoples Group. And we are partnering with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to bring you a series of videos on the topic of anti-Indigenous racism. Today, we'll be diving into our first video focusing on anti-Indigenous racism in the education system. During this video, you will review the definition of anti-Indigenous racism, describe learning and education from an Indigenous perspective prior to colonization, explain how the history of colonial education may currently affect relationships and interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. First, let's take a moment to define anti-Indigenous racism. Anti-Indigenous racism is defined as the ongoing race-based discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice experienced by Indigenous peoples within Canada. It includes ideologies and practices that contribute to the establishment, maintenance, and perpetuation of power imbalances, structural obstacles, and inequitable results in Canada as a result of colonial policies and practices. What are some examples of anti-Indigenous racism? According to the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health, within Canada, anti-Indigenous racism is expressed in numerous ways, through stereotyping, stigmatization, and violence, as well as through many of the structures of Canadian society. Some examples of anti-Indigenous racism expressed through stereotyping include how Indigenous peoples are portrayed in the media. Media decision-makers select what to report, and in so doing, can enhance or damage public opinion of Indigenous peoples. Another example surrounds the appropriation of Indigenous nation or community names for team mascots. Many supporters of this type of appropriation stand behind the sentiment that their usage of Indigenous nation or community names is intended to honor Indigenous peoples. Anti-Indigenous racism has lived within the Canadian education system for quite some time, situating Western knowledge as legitimate and Indigenous knowledge as inferior. When thinking about our topic, anti-Indigenous racism in the education system, we may be quick to think that this video's target audience is educators. It is important to reflect upon our own interactions with the education system as learners, as parents, and guardians of learners, as well as educators. We have a thinking job for our viewers today, which is to reflect on how can we know our role in reconciliation if we haven't learned accurate histories of Indigenous peoples. We invite all of you viewing this video to engage in learning more holistic histories of Canada that are inclusive of Indigenous peoples. When we broaden our awareness of these histories from an Indigenous lens, we are working to combat stereotypes, fill in the gaps from our own educational experiences, and move to become informed allies. Let's begin by discussing what education may have looked like in Indigenous communities prior to colonization. Prior to colonization, Indigenous nations and cultures had their own systems to prepare their children for participation in their societies. Rastool has written that there are two core tenets of Indigenous education. Everything is alive, and we are all related. It was understood that education was lifelong, experiential, goes beyond a formal classroom, and is based on the various aspects of Indigenous cultures. Children were provided the space and grace to practice being in good relations with one another, following their traditional teachings. I have often heard elders and knowledge keepers speak about the role of community in terms of supporting children in discovering their inherent gifts. It was once explained to me that adults within a village would observe young children carrying out their daily tasks with special attention to what gravitated toward and what seemed to come natural to them. Once it was determined what their inherent gift was, the community would support the cultivation of that gift by exposing the child to as many opportunities as possible to hone and practice the specific skill. For the Haudenosaunee, their communities were organized in clans and families, where members would support each other based on need and capability. Learning activities were open to all community members and were not designed to prepare for any particular economic role, nor did they differentiate between children based on ability. Through its positioning as superior to that of Indigenous, colonial education has worked in an effort to displace, replace, and erase. What we see in the modern context are disparities in attainment, training, and funding across many Indigenous communities. Since 2016, overall First Nation, Métis, and Inuit education attainment has improved. According to the 2021 census, the percentage of First Nations people without any level of formal education, that being a certificate, diploma, or degree, is 33%. This compares to 15.5% for non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. In 2021, 9% of First Nations people aged 25 to 64 had a bachelor's degree or higher, which compares to 27.4% for non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Those reporting Indigenous identity, meanwhile, have college credentials at higher levels similar to those of non-visible minority, non-Indigenous Canadians, but university attainment rates are substantially lower than those of other Canadians. 2021 census data also reveals that more Indigenous peoples are working in trades than non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. According to a report by former TD Bank economist Don Drummond, the funding gap between First Nations schools versus other schools across Canada averages around 30%. Meanwhile, Indigenous leaders are committed to finding a way to bridge that gap, to retain autonomy over their schools, and fight for equal resources for their students. Colonial education systems have had a drastic impact on Indigenous languages. According to a 2017 report from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, most Indigenous languages in Canada are not likely to survive without massive revitalization efforts. Only Inuktitut, Cree, and Ojibwe are considered strong enough to be able to survive into the next century. How has colonial education impacted the health and vitality of Indigenous languages? What greater implications does this have on Indigenous communities? To answer this, we turn to Cayuga language speaker and linguistics student, Mackenzie Sandy.
Indigenous languages for Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples are health determinants. We are at our healthiest in every sense of the phrase when we have our languages. The largest impacts directly of colonial education was the severance of what we call intergenerational language transmission. So this is where, grandpa and grandma speak a language to, mom or dad, and mom or dad speaks language to the baby. That's an intergenerational language transmission cycle. And largely due to colonial education and colonialism more generally, this system of transmission has become disrupted. The efforts and positive impacts of revitalization have been in direct response to the colonial education systems, and we're consistently fighting back, and we are consistently fighting for our languages and thus the health of one another as well. These languages that are the original ones from Turtle Island have the original instructions, the original tools, the original roadmaps to the way that we as Ongohoe people came to understand and take care of the world around us. We learn from the natural world to take care of one another, to take care of the land, and all these things. And I think that it's so beautiful that we still have access to the languages, again, with these original instructions and materials in them.
Let's return to our thinking job that was described at the beginning of this video. How are we to know our role in reconciliation if we have not learned accurate histories about Indigenous peoples? My own sense is there's lots of resources for us to do our individual learning. There's some great books out there. There's documentaries. There's even movies. There's Indigenous cultural centers where people can go to engage in conversation with Indigenous people to fill in gaps in knowledge. There's lots of opportunities that all of us have to increase our knowledge about Indigenous histories in Canada. We hope you enjoyed engaging with this topic today. Be sure to check back for the second video in this series to learn more about the Indian residential school system and how education was used as a tool for the attempted assimilation of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Nyaweh, miigwech, thank you, merci.